In May 2011, at precisely 11:43 p.m., Amina's phone rang, slicing through the silence of the night. The voice on the other end was low, urgent, and far too familiar. It was Rafiq. "Amina," he whispered, his tone heavy with something she couldn't quite place. "I need to see you right now. It's an emergency." Amina sat up in bed, blinking the sleep from her eyes as her mind scrambled to make sense of the situation. Why was he calling her so late? Rafiq never called at night. He usually claimed it was improper and something he would never do. Yet here he was, breaking his own rule. But his voice sounded different, softer even. "Please," he repeated, almost a plea. "It's urgent. I can't talk over the phone." Amina felt her heart hammer against her chest as she whispered, "What's wrong, Rafiq?" There was a pause. "Just come," he said quietly. "You're the only one I can trust." Those words pierced through Amina, stirring something inside her that wasn't entirely comfort. She had felt uneasy around Rafiq recently, and his presence no longer felt safe. She thought back to moments that seemed innocent before. The way his hand lingered on her shoulder when no one was around. The way he'd look at her in ways that made her uncomfortable. But he was a family friend. Everyone trusted him. Her parents, her siblings. They saw him as a guide, almost a second father. Why didn't she feel the same? She hesitated, but the desperation in his voice pulled her in. "I'll come," she finally agreed, her voice barely a whisper. Quietly, she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her parents, who trusted Rafiq so implicitly that they'd think nothing of her meeting him late at night. As she walked through the empty streets, a strange sense of dread crept over her. She had grown up around Rafiq. He was the one who'd always been there at family gatherings, always guiding her. But these last few months had changed things, changed her perception of him. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a line she'd never be able to return from. She finally arrived at the secluded spot Rafiq had described, just outside of town. The moon cast long shadows over the trees, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. A chill ran down her spine as she spotted him standing there alone, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on her in the moonlight. He looked so composed, almost too calm. Something about his stillness made her heart pound even harder. "Thank you for coming, Amina," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to tell her something she wasn't ready to hear. "Rafiq, what's going on?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. For a moment he looked away, his face cast in shadow. "Amina," he began, "you know I've always looked out for you. I've protected you from things you didn't even realize." She blinked, feeling a wave of confusion. "What are you talking about?" He took a step closer, and she felt an instinctual urge to step back. "Don't be scared," he said softly, reaching out toward her. His hand brushed against her arm, and she shivered, though the night was warm. "I need you to trust me. After all, isn't that what we've always had? Trust? Trust." The word felt heavy, almost suffocating. Here was a man everyone trusted so completely. A man who had wormed his way so deeply into her family that no one would ever question his motives. Not even now. And in that moment, Amina felt a pang of doubt so sharp it left her breathless. "Why don't you trust me?" he asked, his voice as smooth as silk, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread curling in her stomach. What was he hiding behind those calm, reassuring eyes? He moved even closer, his hand tightening slightly around her wrist. Amina's pulse quickened, and her instincts screamed at her to pull away. But as she opened her mouth to say something, to question his intentions, maybe even ask why he'd been so possessive these past months, he pulled her close, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Amina," he said, his voice suddenly cold, "do you think anyone would believe you if you told them something crazy about me? Something they'd never expect?" Her heart stopped. The ease with which he said those words, as if he already knew what she was thinking, left her speechless. He smiled, a smile that sent an icy shiver down her spine. In that moment, she realized no one would ever believe her. Not her family, not her friends. He had already poisoned their minds, planting stories and doubts that painted her as the one with issues, not him. She pulled away, her breath shallow as she looked at him, seeing him for the first time as the stranger he really was. What, what do you want from me? She asked, her voice breaking. He smirked, leaning in close enough that she could feel his breath on her skin. I just want you to know, he whispered, that there's nowhere you can go where I won't find you. As she backed away, finally breaking free from his grasp, she felt a terror so deep it was as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Whatever was coming, she knew it was only the beginning. You can't escape me, Amina, he said softly, watching her retreat. You're mine. 6 months earlier, it was the peak of community festivities, the air buzzing with excitement and chatter. It was in this bustling setting that Amina, just 17, crossed paths with Rafiq, a family friend everyone respected. He was well regarded, always dressed impeccably, always seemingly caring, and in these circles, people trusted him without question. Rafiq, at 38, had built a name for himself as a well-respected businessman and mentor, especially to younger family members who admired his knowledge and experience. That day, he approached Amina with a warm smile. You're quite talented, aren't you? He said, his voice soft but penetrating. He had noticed her efforts in organizing part of the event, making sure everything ran smoothly. To Amina, it felt like he saw her in a way others hadn't before. Thank you, she replied, a bit surprised. Most people didn't pay much attention to her, especially not someone like Rafiq, who was always surrounded by adults eager for his advice. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if he were sharing a secret just for her. You have something special, Amina, a focus and grace that not many people your age possess. She felt her cheeks flush. No one had ever spoken to her like this, especially someone like him, someone her parents constantly praised. It felt flattering, but something about the way his gaze lingered made her feel a tightness in her chest. Why did she feel as if she couldn't breathe? As the months went on, Rafiq became a fixture in her life. He was there at family dinners, community events, and even some of her school events. At first, Amina thought it was just a coincidence. He'd show up unexpectedly and always make his way over to her, asking about her day, her dreams, her worries. He'd tilt his head in a way that seemed so understanding, so concerned, that she'd end up sharing things she didn't even talk about with her family. You know, Amina, he said one day, leaning back with a thoughtful expression, you shouldn't let others define your future for you. His words were spoken with such care, like he was trying to protect her from something. It's your life. Your family means well, but they might not always understand you as I do. Amina blinked. She had never thought about it like that. Her family was traditional, yes, but she had always accepted it without question. Yet here was Rafiq, subtly suggesting there was more out there. More freedom, more choice, more understanding. The more he spoke, the more she found herself doubting things she'd once accepted without hesitation. Rafiq's approach was never forceful, always gentle, as if guiding her through realizations she might never have had otherwise. He'd tell her stories about his life, painting himself as someone who had struggled to make his own choices, who had faced the same challenges, and had come out stronger. You remind me of myself at your age, he'd say, his voice rich with empathy. And every time Amina felt that strange pull toward him, he was always there, like a presence in the back of her mind she couldn't shake. But one evening, as he complimented her maturity, Amina felt a flicker of something uneasy beneath the praise. Everyone saw a mentor, but why did his eyes hold something she couldn't place? She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was silly. After all, he was Rafiq. Her family trusted him, respected him. They would never let anyone unsafe near her. But despite herself, a seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few weeks, their interactions continued. Rafiq started calling her wise beyond her years, a compliment that made her feel unique, yet isolated from those her own age. You're not like other girls, he'd say, his voice filled with admiration. You have a depth about you that most people just don't understand. And with every passing compliment, she found herself growing closer to him. But there were moments, a touch that lasted a fraction too long, a look that lingered, where something felt off. One afternoon during a family gathering, Rafiq approached her as usual, but this time he placed his hand on her shoulder, his grip warm and familiar. Amina, he said, looking at her as if she were the only person in the room, you deserve to be seen for who you are. Remember, you have me if you need someone to talk to. She smiled, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and unease. No one had ever told her these things before, made her feel this valued. But was it really value, or was it something else entirely? Her family, oblivious, praised Rafiq every chance they got. Her parents constantly reminded her of how lucky they were to have him in their lives. He's always been like a brother to us, her father would say, pride filling his voice. Her mother would nod, adding, he's someone you can look up to, Amina. And Rafiq's influence wasn't limited to her family's good graces. Her friends even admired him. He'd ask them about their studies, give them advice on career paths, and always seemed so wise, so noble. But the more her family and friends adored him, the more Amina felt a quiet dread settle in her heart. How could she be the only one who felt that something was wrong? One evening as she walked back home, her mind swirling with thoughts, she replayed one of their recent conversations. He told her, Amina, you're smart. You're not like others. You understand things. But something about his tone had left her feeling trapped. Was it just her imagination? She kept brushing it off, reasoning that it was her own insecurities or her mind playing tricks. After all, this was Rafiq, a man her family trusted completely. But as she lay in bed that night, his words echoed in her mind, a shadow lingering in the quiet. Everyone else around her saw a mentor, a guide. But Amina couldn't shake the feeling that his attention lingered just a moment too long. Why was it only her heart that pounded with a strange unease every time he was near? Over the months, Rafiq's presence in Amina's life grew even more persistent, slipping into her routines with an ease that made her question whether she had always felt this level of unease around him. It wasn't the overt actions that alarmed her. It was the subtle things that seemed almost designed to fly under everyone else's radar. Amina's friends and family continued to treat him like the dependable family friend he portrayed himself to be. And in many ways, she wondered if she was imagining things, if her concerns were just that, hers alone. But things slowly began to escalate. It was on a rainy Tuesday afternoon that Amina found a handwritten letter waiting for her in her usual study spot at the library. No name, no sender, just her name scrawled on the front in bold letters. The note inside was brief yet unsettling. I see something truly special in you, Amina. Don't let anyone hold you back. Amina's heart pounded as she read the words over and over, hoping to find some benign explanation. She considered it might be from a friend or someone who simply admired her, but deep down, she knew it was him. She crumpled the letter in her hands, stuffing it into her bag, trying to erase the crawling feeling spreading over her skin. This couldn't be happening, she thought, clinging to the hope that it was all in her head. But over the following weeks, Rafiq became bolder, always showing up in places she frequented, sometimes by chance, and sometimes with planned encounters that he painted as coincidences. One evening after class, she caught a glimpse of his car in her peripheral vision. He waved, giving her that ever-familiar smile, and commented, just passing by. Funny how we keep meeting like this, isn't it? She forced a smile, but inside her heart hammered with a feeling she was quickly losing control over her life. Why did he always seem to be wherever she was, as though he had memorized her routines? It wasn't long before the coincidences felt more like orchestrated traps. Once he left a small gift, an intricately carved wooden necklace with her initial on it, on her desk at school. The sight of it made her skin prickle. Her friends admired it, cooing over the beautiful design, assuming it was from her family or a friend. But the look on her face when she saw it, pure terror, told a different story. It's just a kind gesture, she tried to convince herself, fighting the feeling that every gift, every appearance, was closing in on her personal space, hemming her in from all sides. One evening, as she was getting ready to leave an evening study session, her phone vibrated with a message. The number was unknown, but her heart dropped as she read the message. I hope you're studying well, Amina. I'm always here if you need someone to talk to. She froze, her eyes darting around the quiet library. How could he have her number? She hadn't given it to him. And yet, there it was. She went to her family that night, her fingers trembling, as she showed her father the messages. "It's strange, but I think Rafiq has been following me." Her voice was almost a whisper, filled with uncertainty and fear. Her father glanced at the messages, brow furrowing, but his reaction wasn't what she expected. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Rafiq has always been close to our family, Amina. You're probably just misinterpreting his kindness. He's just looking out for you." Her heart sank as her family dismissed her concerns, chalking it up to a misunderstanding. Was she really overreacting? Or had Rafiq manipulated their trust so perfectly that even her fears couldn't penetrate it? But it didn't end there. In the days that followed, he left messages in her locker, texted from new numbers, and even appeared at the coffee shop she'd recently started going to just to avoid him. Her sense of dread escalated each day, but she felt trapped in the persona he had so carefully crafted. Every interaction he initiated seemed, on the surface, perfectly harmless. He'd compliment her schoolwork, ask about her family, offer advice on her career, all things a family friend might do. But she knew. She could feel his eyes lingering on her, the weight of his attention like a heavy shroud she couldn't shake off. Why did no one else see it, she wondered, the unease settling in her bones. She felt herself being pulled into a world where nothing made sense, where her words weren't trusted, and her safety felt precariously fragile. The breaking point came one quiet evening when Amina arrived home to find a small package on her doorstep. There was no note, no return address, but inside lay a framed photo of her, clearly taken without her knowledge during one of her family gatherings. It was a candid shot, her face partially turned, the smile on her face looking haunting under the new light cast upon it. She felt her breath catch as she stared at the photo, her fingers trembling as she clutched it. How had he been able to take this picture? And why leave it on her doorstep, like a token of his intrusion into her life? In a final attempt, she tried once more to speak with her mother, hoping for any sign of understanding. "Mom, I think Rafiq is watching me. I found this on our doorstep." She handed her the photo, her heart pounding with fear and frustration. But her mother's expression softened, and she gave her daughter a reassuring smile. "Sweetheart, Rafiq has been nothing but kind to this family. You're probably overthinking it. He cares about you, Amina. He's only trying to help." Amina bit her lip, the weight of disbelief pressing down on her. How could her own family be so blinded? She knew she was running out of options, that something was very, very wrong. But if her family wouldn't believe her, then who would? Amina's world grew darker with each passing day. The moments when she felt safe were dwindling, leaving only pockets of fear and solitude in their place. Her trust in her family's ability to protect her was crumbling, and every attempt to raise her concerns was met with the same responses, each one an echo of the last. "You're overreacting. Rafiq has always been good to our family." But then came a night that would mark a turning point for her, a point where her fears solidified, the boundaries between concern and terror erased. It was late, the evening thick with the weight of a storm rolling in. As Amina walked home from a study group, she felt a prickling at the back of her neck. She quickened her pace, telling herself it was just paranoia, that the shadows playing across the street were her imagination. But as she rounded the corner, she saw it. A car idling at the edge of her street, headlights off but unmistakable in its shape. It was Rafiq's car. Her heart dropped, her instincts screaming at her to run, but she felt rooted to the spot, trapped in that second where reality crashed down on her. She turned, feigning a casual pace until she reached her front door. She fumbled with her keys, casting glances over her shoulder, and finally pushed herself inside, slamming the door and locking it behind her. Her breath was heavy, a mix of anger, fear, and helplessness swirling in her mind. She wanted to scream, to tell her family that he was following her even at night, that her fears were real, tangible, lurking just outside their door. But a sinking feeling reminded her that they would only repeat what they had told her before. "He's looking out for you, Amina." Determined to find proof, something that couldn't be dismissed so easily, Amina decided to document everything. She kept a journal, noting every time Rafiq's car appeared outside her school, every strange message she received, every gift he left without explanation. She started to capture photos, anything that might one day serve as evidence if she ever found herself in a position to expose him. But it was exhausting. Every day was a battle against a ghost only she could see, a battle that left her feeling isolated and drained. She stopped confiding in friends, fearing that they too might misunderstand, or worse, report it back to her family. Her grades began to slip, her once bright energy dimming under the weight of her secret burden. And while Rafiq continued to present himself as the family's beloved friend, her interactions with him grew more strained, her polite smiles barely concealing the terror and revulsion gnawing at her from within. Then one evening, just when she thought things couldn't escalate further, she received a message from an unknown number. "I know you've been keeping notes on me, Amina. But remember, no one else will believe you." Her heart froze. She stared at the screen, her hands trembling as the message seared itself into her mind. He knew. He knew she had been documenting everything, watching her as intently as she tried to shield herself from his gaze. How could he know? Had he somehow been inside her room? Was he monitoring her every step? The message didn't come with threats. It didn't need to. The knowledge that he was aware of her attempts to gather evidence only served to deepen her isolation, as if he were one step ahead at every turn, blocking every path to escape. That night she sat on her bed, replaying every instance in her mind, every subtle threat, every glance he had cast her way that lingered just a beat too long. A single terrifying realization settled over her like a shroud. No one would believe her unless something terrible happened, unless he finally crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. And as she sat in the dim glow of her bedroom light, she couldn't help but feel that the line would be crossed sooner rather than later. Her family, her community, her friends, every single one of them was in the grip of Rafiq's deception. But Amina knew the truth. His kindness was a mask, and she was the only one who could see the sinister expression hidden beneath it. From that night on, she vowed to protect herself, to find some way to unmask him before it was too late. But in a world where her own family was blind to the danger she faced, Amina knew that she was on her own, and that, in itself, was the greatest danger of all. As the weeks wore on, Amina's life became an unending nightmare of vigilance and fear. Every step outside felt like walking a razor's edge. With each routine moment, grocery shopping, walking to the library, even attending school, carrying the gnawing dread that he was there, watching her every move. And each day, her interactions with her family became more strained, every unheeded warning a painful reminder that she was utterly alone in her battle. One afternoon, while meeting her mother and two aunts at a cafe, Amina tried once more to convey her anxieties, choosing her words carefully to avoid sounding paranoid. "I've been feeling uncomfortable with how close Rafiq's been lately," she said cautiously, her voice barely a whisper above the chatter around them. Her mother raised an eyebrow, a slight frown tugging at her lips. "What are you saying, Amina?" she asked, her tone a mixture of confusion and impatience. "Rafiq has always been nothing but kind to you. He's like family to us." Her aunts exchanged glances, and one chuckled. "Oh dear, you're just imagining things. Rafiq is a gentleman, not some shady character." Their laughter was a jab to Amina's heart, dismissing her concerns as nothing more than youthful overthinking. "But what if he's not who he seems?" she insisted, a hint of desperation in her voice. The words hung heavy in the air, but they were met with exasperated sighs. "Amina," her mother said firmly, "you need to stop this nonsense. Rafiq is an honorable man. You should be grateful he takes such an interest in your well-being." With each dismissive response, her stomach twisted painfully. They weren't just dismissing her, they were validating his innocence, siding with the very person she was terrified of. The realization was unbearable, isolating her further in a cage of disbelief and silence. Days passed and the stalking escalated. Amina began to receive anonymous notes, carefully folded slips of paper with chilling phrases like, "You can't escape me," and "You're always being watched." Sometimes she would find them tucked into her school bag, other times in her locker. She no longer questioned how he did it. She knew he was finding ways to breach her life at every turn. Her only solace lay in the security of her locked room at night, though even that felt like a fleeting sanctuary. But then came the breaking point. One evening, Amina returned home after a particularly late study session. She unlocked her front door, her body weary from the day's tension, and entered the darkened house. Something felt wrong immediately, a subtle shift in the air, the silence more oppressive than usual. She glanced around, eyes darting to every shadow. It was then she noticed it. Her laptop, which she was sure she had left closed and on her desk, was now open. The screen glowed faintly in the darkness, casting an eerie light across her bedroom. Her heart pounded as she slowly approached, her pulse a deafening roar in her ears. She reached out with a trembling hand and moved the cursor. Her inbox was open, one she used only for personal notes and messages she dared not keep on paper. The most recent message was an email. The sender's name read simply as Anonymous. With her breath caught in her throat, she clicked on it. Inside was a single line. Your secrets are my secrets. Her blood ran cold. The message confirmed her worst fears. He had access to her private life, even in her safest space. He was closer than she'd ever imagined, reaching into her world without permission, without boundaries. Her room, her notes, her very thoughts, they were all open to him, and there was no telling how much he had seen. In a panic, she raced downstairs, intending to confront her parents, to finally demand they see the danger she was in. But before she could even open her mouth, her father looked up from his reading and said, Amina, Rafiq stopped by today. He was asking about you. Said he was worried because he hadn't heard from you much lately. We thought it was so sweet of him. Her throat tightened, a scream dying in her chest as she realized that every word she might say would only fall on deaf ears. They saw his concern as affection, his invasions as care. To them, he was a friend. To her, he was her living nightmare. Desperation clawed at her. She knew she needed to find a way to protect herself, to escape this trap of disbelief and suffocating danger. That night, she lay awake, formulating a plan. The world around her was blinded by his mask, but she would find a way to shatter it. It was time to stop pleading for understanding and to take matters into her own hands, even if it meant unraveling her life in the process. Her resolve hardened. She would gather evidence, expose him herself, and if no one believed her, if her family continued to side with him, then she would go to someone who could help. She would find a way to make them see the monster hiding in plain sight, but the cost, she feared, would be more than she could ever imagine. Amina's resolve strengthened with each day, though the fear and dread loomed like a constant shadow. She had no clear path, but she knew she couldn't live in this nightmare any longer. If no one else would listen, she'd find a way to make them. Her mission now was to gather evidence, irrefutable proof that Rafiq wasn't the caring family friend everyone thought. One morning, she decided to start with something simple. She grabbed her phone, making sure to turn the volume down, and tucked it into her pocket, ready to record any interactions with him. She'd observed Rafiq enough to know he often showed up at the community center where she volunteered. So with her nerves tightly wound, she went, praying for the courage to keep her calm. It wasn't long before she spotted him, leaning casually against the doorway, his face lighting up when he saw her. Her stomach twisted as he approached, his warm, seemingly innocent smile masking a sinister intent. "Hello, Amina," he greeted, his voice a tone too soft, too familiar. "You've been busy lately. I was beginning to wonder if you were avoiding me." She forced a smile, though her fingers clenched into fists at her sides. "Oh, I've just had a lot on my plate with school and everything," she replied lightly, praying he couldn't sense her discomfort. But he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I hope you're not forgetting our conversations. It would be a shame for anything to slip, don't you think?" Her pulse quickened. The thinly veiled threat wasn't lost on her. She pressed her hands deeper into her pockets, steadying herself as she discreetly clicked record on her phone. "I haven't forgotten," she managed, forcing her voice to remain even. "I've just had to be careful." He nodded slowly, an approving smile touching his lips. "Good girl," he murmured, patting her shoulder as if he were some benevolent figure. But the dark glint in his eyes betrayed his intention. It wasn't kindness. It was control. As soon as he left, Amina exhaled, her entire body shuddering as the tension ebbed. She had the recording now, something to prove that his intentions weren't what they seemed. But she knew she needed more than just a vague conversation. She'd have to catch him in an act that would shatter his innocent facade entirely. The following days, she continued gathering small pieces of evidence, recording unsettling conversations, photographing notes he slipped into her bag, keeping every eerie message he left on her phone. Each time she looked at her evidence, she felt a flicker of hope. This was her lifeline, her one chance to reveal the truth and break free. Yet despite her determination, there was an underlying fear that gnawed at her. What if her family still didn't believe her? What if they saw only what they wanted to see? A kind-hearted man, concerned for her well-being, and a daughter misinterpreting his kindness? One night she decided to confide in her closest friend, Layla, hoping that sharing the burden might bring her some relief. They met at a small cafe where she poured out everything, her fears, her evidence, and the twisted reality she'd been living in. Layla listened in stunned silence, her eyes widening with each revelation. Amina, this is, this is terrifying, Layla whispered, glancing around as if afraid Rafiq himself might overhear. Why haven't you gone to the police? Amina's shoulders slumped. My family wouldn't believe me, Layla. They'd say I'm misunderstanding him, that he's just worried. And without them on my side, what can I really do? Layla reached across the table, gripping Amina's hand tightly. Then we'll make them believe, Amina. You're not alone in this. I'll help you, whatever it takes. That moment gave her a renewed sense of strength, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could succeed. Together they hatched a plan. Layla would help her keep track of Rafiq's visits, subtly drawing attention whenever he acted out of line. They'd create a record that would be hard to ignore. But as Amina left the cafe that night, she spotted something in the shadows across the street. A figure, barely visible under the dim glow of the street lamp, watching her. Even from the distance, she knew it was him. Her heart plummeted. He had followed her. He knew she was taking steps to expose him. And now he was watching her more closely than ever, his intentions darkening with each passing day. In the days that followed, Rafiq's behavior became increasingly erratic. He seemed to appear everywhere she went, his eyes lingering on her with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Amina's every attempt to evade him only seemed to fuel his fixation, and each encounter left her with the growing dread that he was becoming dangerously unhinged. The tension reached a breaking point one evening when Amina returned home to find her room disturbed. Her once neatly organized belongings were strewn about, her drawers open, and papers scattered across her desk. The most chilling discovery was a note, scrawled hastily, placed squarely in the middle of her bed. You can't hide from me. In that moment, she felt the walls of her world closing in. The threat was no longer subtle. It was a direct assault on her last vestiges of safety. He was warning her, claiming control, and daring her to challenge him. Gripping her phone tightly, she took a photo of the scene, of the note, knowing she'd need every bit of proof she could gather. She thought back to her conversation with Layla, of their plan, and steeled herself for what lay ahead. This was no longer a battle to be fought in silence. That night as she lay in bed, she realized she had only one choice. She'd confront Rafiq herself, force him to reveal his true intentions, even if it meant putting herself directly in harm's way. It was a gamble, a desperate move born out of fear and the exhaustion of constant vigilance. But Amina knew one thing for certain. If she didn't take action now, his control over her life would only tighten until there was no escape. The confrontation with Rafiq weighed on Amina's mind, her nerves fraying with each passing day. She knew that facing him alone would be risky, but she saw no other way to end this nightmare. The evidence she'd gathered felt like a lifeline, but she needed more. Something undeniable that would make everyone see him for who he truly was. 2 days later, Amina set her plan into motion. She asked Rafiq to meet her at the quiet park where he'd often find her during her evening runs. The pretense was simple. She wanted to talk things out, give him a chance to explain himself. Of course, her phone would be recording, capturing every word. The evening was damp and cold, the air thick with anticipation as she waited for him under a dim streetlight. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands shaking as she gripped her phone in her pocket. She told herself she was prepared, but the fear gnawing at her betrayed the fragile confidence she'd clung to. Just as the sky turned an inky blue, she saw him approach, his familiar figure casting a long shadow as he drew near. He wore that same deceptively warm smile, his hands tucked casually into his coat pockets, a false sense of ease that only made her more anxious. "Thank you for meeting me," she started, forcing herself to stay calm, her voice even. "I thought maybe we could talk about everything. Clear the air." He tilted his head, studying her intently. "Of course, Amina. I'm glad you reached out," he replied smoothly, but there was a glint in his eyes, a calculated look that sent a chill down her spine. As they talked, she steered the conversation, subtly prompting him to reveal more about his intentions, pushing him to slip up. But Rafiq was skilled, masterfully evading her traps, his responses so carefully crafted that even her recording felt futile. Yet she persisted, determined to capture something, anything, that would unmask him. Finally, her patience broke, and she asked directly, "Why won't you just leave me alone, Rafiq? Why do you keep coming back into my life, trying to control everything I do?" There was a pause, a fleeting moment where his mask slipped. His eyes darkened, and his tone shifted. "Control, Amina?" he murmured, a hint of anger beneath the surface. "This is concern. This is guidance. Your family may not understand what's best for you, but I do. I'm the one who cares, the one who sees you." The intensity in his voice shook her, and she could feel the weight of his fixation, the twisted conviction that he was entitled to her life, her choices, her very existence. "That's not love," she replied firmly, swallowing the lump in her throat. "That's obsession, and I don't want it. I don't need it. I need you to leave me alone." He stepped closer, his face shadowed under the dim light, and the menace in his gaze grew sharper. "You don't understand what you're asking, Amina," he hissed, his tone low and chilling. "Without me, you'll fall apart. I've kept you safe. I've protected you, and you repay me with this?" She felt trapped, his words suffocating her, the air thickening with each breath. For a moment she was paralyzed, his presence overpowering, his twisted words rooting her in place. But then, a light from a nearby car flickered as it passed, snapping her out of the trance. Her courage returned, and with it, a final spark of defiance. "I don't need your protection, Rafiq. I'll be fine on my own." She took a step back, her voice steady but low. "This ends now." For a moment, he merely stared at her, a mixture of anger and disbelief crossing his face. But then he laughed, a soft, unsettling sound that chilled her to the bone. "You think it's that simple? That you can just walk away?" His smile turned into a sneer. "No, Amina, you're not going anywhere. Not without me." She took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stay calm, to not show him any fear. "You don't own me, Rafiq," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You never did." In a swift movement, she turned and started walking away, not daring to look back. She felt his gaze burning into her, his presence heavy even as the distance between them grew. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Layla, checking in on her. It was a reminder of the support she had, the hope that she could fight this and win, but she knew this wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a darker battle. Rafiq wasn't the type to give up, and she'd challenged him, made him angrier than ever. The following days were a blur. She stayed close to her family, avoided going out alone, and kept Layla updated on every interaction with him. But the tension was unbearable. The knowledge that he was always watching, waiting, lurking in the shadows of her life. One evening, she received a message from an unknown number, a single photo taken through the window of her bedroom with a chilling message underneath. "I see you." That was the breaking point. Her fear transformed into a cold, determined rage, and she knew she couldn't fight this alone any longer. She went to her parents, determined to make them listen, to show them the evidence and make them understand the danger lurking within their trusted friend. But when she finally gathered her courage and showed them the photos, the recordings, the texts, everything she'd endured, their reaction shattered her. Her father shook his head, his face a mask of disbelief. "Amina, I don't know where you got this idea, but Rafiq is a good man. He's helped this family for years." Why would he do this? The word struck her like a slap. He's not who you think he is. He's been following me, harassing me, threatening me. Can't you see? But they only looked at her, their skepticism a reflection of the loyalty they held to Rafiq, a loyalty she couldn't break. In that moment, she felt completely isolated, abandoned by the very people she had hoped would save her. With one final plea, she whispered, "Please, please believe me." Her mother reached out to pat her shoulder, a faint look of pity in her eyes. "Amina, you're young. Maybe you misinterpreted things. I'm sure there's an explanation for all of this." Her heart shattered. Her last hope crumbled to dust. She was alone in this fight, trapped in a nightmare where the very people she trusted had turned their backs on her. But even in her despair, a spark of resilience ignited within her. If no one else would stand beside her, she would stand alone. And this time, she would end it for good. The night felt darker than usual as Amina retreated to her room, the weight of her family's disbelief pressing on her chest. Her mind whirled, grappling with the loneliness, the fear, and the looming presence of Rafiq that she couldn't shake. She had hoped for a lifeline, a chance to reclaim her life with her family's support. But instead, she'd found herself adrift, alone in a sea of disbelief. Desperation gnawed at her. If her own family wouldn't believe her, what hope did she have of getting anyone else to see the truth? Every attempt she'd made to gather proof, every recorded call, every text message, seemed to dissolve under the blinding loyalty her family felt toward Rafiq. But in her solitude, an idea took root. She would gather undeniable evidence, something so irrefutable that even her family's loyalty couldn't obscure it. She needed one final confrontation, a setup where Rafiq would reveal his true intentions, one she could record without him realizing it. A few days later, Amina reached out to him, her message simple: "We need to talk. Meet me at the cafe." She forced herself to sound calm, indifferent even, hiding the fury and fear that burned within her. Rafiq's response was immediate and unsettling. "Of course, anything for you." That response sent a chill down her spine, but she steeled herself. If this worked, she'd finally be free. She arrived at the small, dimly lit cafe, her heart pounding as she positioned herself at a secluded table in the back. She arranged her phone strategically, set to record. The minutes felt like hours as she waited, her gaze drifting to the entrance, her breath shallow. Finally, Rafiq entered, his presence casting an ominous shadow across the room. He looked calm, almost pleased, his demeanor that of a man who felt he had complete control. He slid into the seat across from her, his eyes holding that same possessive intensity that had haunted her for months. Amina tried to maintain her composure. "I want to know why," she said quietly, her voice a tremble despite her best efforts. "Why me? Why this obsession?" Rafiq's smile was unnervingly calm. He leaned forward, speaking in a low, controlled tone. "Amina, you have no idea what you mean to me. You're everything. You're different from the rest of them." His words were laced with an unsettling admiration, a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. "But you know this can't go on," she stammered, feeling her resolve waver. You're You're destroying my life, Rafiq, my family, everything." He looked at her, a glint of annoyance flashing in his eyes. "Amina, your family has always underestimated you. They don't see you the way I do. They never will." Her heart raced, both from fear and the desperation to keep him talking, to get him to reveal the twisted motives he hid so well. They, they believe in you, Rafiq. They trust you. And here you are, manipulating, lying. He cut her off, his voice rising slightly, a crack in his composed facade. "They don't know the real me. They only see what I allow them to see." His tone was cold, his words slipping out with a darkness she hadn't expected. In that moment, Amina knew she had to push him further, break through the veil of respectability he wore so flawlessly. "And what is the real you, Rafiq? The one who lies to my family while stalking their daughter?" A dangerous silence settled between them. For a brief, horrifying moment, his mask slipped entirely, and the man sitting across from her was no longer the trusted family friend, but a predator. He leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. I have done nothing wrong, Amina. You brought this on yourself by resisting. I offered you guidance, protection, and you chose to make me your enemy. The anger bubbling beneath her fear finally erupted. Protection? She whispered fiercely. You've been tearing my life apart, trying to own me, like I'm something you can possess. He straightened, a dark smile stretching across his face. And yet, here you are, alone, with no one believing you. Who will you turn to, Amina? There's no one left. The full weight of her isolation crashed down on her, but her determination held strong. She'd captured enough, his confession, his arrogance, the twisted way he saw her as an object to control. She would make sure everyone heard it. Just as she gathered her courage to leave, Rafiq's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. We're not done here, Amina. Her heart raced, panic flooding her veins, but she forced herself to keep her composure. Let go of me, she said, her voice trembling but firm. You're not walking away this time, he hissed, his grip tightening. Do you think anyone will believe your little story? With every ounce of strength, she pulled her arm free and shot to her feet. Without a backward glance, she left the cafe, her entire body shaking as she walked away. She'd finally captured the proof she needed, but fear and adrenaline left her barely able to breathe. In the safety of her room, she listened to the recording, her hands trembling as Rafiq's words played back. The cold, possessive tone, the menacing promises, it was all there, undeniable. She knew it would be enough to convince her family, to make them see the truth they'd refused to acknowledge. But the next day, as she presented the recording to her parents, a sick feeling crept over her. Instead of anger or shock, her father listened with a skeptical frown. Her mother's face clouded with concern, but for Rafiq, not her. When the recording ended, her father shook his head slowly. Amina, people say things in anger, in confusion. Rafiq has been nothing but good to this family. You're overreacting. Her mother reached out, placing a hand on her arm. Maybe this is all a misunderstanding. Rafiq has always been respectful. Perhaps you misinterpreted his words. Amina felt as if the ground